Publisher-financed games development has a lot of obvious advantages over independent development. More staff, higher production values, longer development cycles, blah blah blah. There are plenty of disadvantages, but there are loads of advantages. And I think the single greatest advantage publisher-financed development has is that they have the means to extensively test their game externally. This could be bringing people in off the street for focus groups, or it could be an online beta, but however they do it, they're getting loads of people unfamiliar with their game to play it and give them feedback which affects the way the game is designed. Some indies will do this with family and friends and stuff, but you can always tell when a game hasn't had any real external testing, because these games always have hugely alienating factors for those new to the game. The people who worked on it, they don't see the problems when they play it, because being the designers, they are intimately familiar with the game's mechanics. How, for instance, can you test how hard a puzzle is yourself when you designed it? And without that external testing, they never will see a problem with it until the day of the game's release, when everyone who buys it collectively asks, WTF? ? And that is probably more true of E.Y.E, Divine Cybermancy, than any other independent game I've ever played. E.Y.E is an FPS RPG, and it's a pretty complex game. It's definitely more on the Deus Ex or System Shock 2 end of the FPS RPG spectrum than the Stalker end. And while the combat is pretty fantastic, the game doesn't really explain itself properly at all, leaving you very confused and very annoyed. The story concerns a faction war in a futuristic cyberpunk world, with you being a member of one of the factions. The sheer volume of optionally readable backstory the game provides is pretty astounding, but the actual story itself is just not all that interesting, largely concerning a MacGuffin and a double cross. And without giving any spoilers, I will just say that the story cheaply and pretentiously leads into a New Game Plus at the end. This makes the story something you probably won't really want to follow, but this is compounded by the English dialogue being awful. I'm sure that the French language version, if there is one, is perfectly fine, but the English translation is just awful. You know when you put non-English phrases through Google Translate and they come out not quite right? All of E.Y.E reads like that. For instance, when you try to pick up an item that you don't have room for in your inventory, the text message reads, "Not enough place in your inventory." There's just nothing even vaguely convincing about the dialogue, which plays a large role in you just not caring about the story. Another big problem is that the text is tiny. It's a colour that isn't easy to read, and there's no background for the text window, making it impossible to read depending on what's in the background. I suffered through it for a few hours, and then I just started skipping bits. And that's a pity, because it's a really cool game world. It's a Blade Runner meets Warhammer 40k sort of thing, with a distinctly oriental twist. If nothing else, it's culturally pretty unique, and as someone sick of seeing most games set in America, I just love it. None of the dialogue is voiced, which I like, and there's also a fake language used sometimes which draws from Japanese, and I'm told there's some French in there too, and perhaps a few other languages. It's very cool, and if you'd like to see references, you'll definitely get a kick out of the game environment. There's a level called Electric Sheep, there's a bar called Tech Noir, there's a planet called Sulaco, there's a character called Dutch, and there's an enemy called the Deus Ex, and I'm sure there are plenty more I haven't found yet. But even this cool homage-filled world is undermined in some ways. Like, for instance, there are these goofy enemies that are giant lizard men with huge hands that throw fireballs, and there are also werewolves. It's a far cry from the cyberpunk dream game that we've all been waiting for when this stuff is factored in. Oh, and enemies that look basically the same as the Barons of Hell from Doom show up, and later in even some cyber demons. It feels less and less like a cool fusing of aesthetics and more like a throw it all against the wall and don't even bother to see what sticks sort of situation. But don't get me wrong, the cool world stuff in E.Y.E is very, very cool. It's just diluted by other weird stuff that shouldn't really be in the game. There's a very pronounced character building mechanic. The game opens with a stats screen sort of thing where you select 3 genes which increase and decrease your starting stats. This is all well and good, but it comes before the tutorial, not that the tutorial really adequately explains anything anyway. So you're expected to make some pretty big choices without even knowing what you want or how things work. And this sense of bafflement only gets worse throughout the game. I'll give you an example of what you can expect. All of your cybernetic abilities are powered by energy. You can buy an implant that converts your health into energy, called a power conversion. When you go to buy it, it tells you that the item needs to be researched first. So you go to your research list and there's no item called a power conversion. In the research list, it's called a vitality converter, but the only way you'll discover this is the correct item is by just randomly researching it. But this costs money, and money is quite precious. I took a leap of faith and just researched it anyway. Luckily for me, it turned out to be what I wanted, so I could then buy the power conversion, which I did. Having bought the power conversion, I then tried it out, only to find that it doesn't even work. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong, though I also don't see how I could be doing something wrong, but when I switch it on to activate it, nothing happens. And this sort of thing isn't an isolated example, the whole game is confusing. For instance, you can use the right mouse button to parry bullets with your sword, and you regenerate energy faster when you're crouching. These facts are both explained in tooltips during loading, but this means you can easily be halfway into the game before you finally get these tips, and they aren't insignificant things either. I was on the final level when I discovered that crouching increased your energy recharge speed. Another big problem with the character development system is that it's largely money-based. You earn experience and levels and points to distribute to your physical stats, and that's all fine. But everything else is bought with money. You can buy psionic spells, cybernetic abilities, physical enhancements such as a cyber brain or a snazzy new metal ribcage. You can unlock new weapons, and researching things also costs money. But tying these things to money is the worst of both worlds. Early on you have so little money that it can take quite a while for your character build to begin to take form, to the extent that you can be halfway through the game and still lack core skills. But then later on, because you can return to missions and just grind like crazy, you can find yourself with so much money that you can buy everything your stats will allow you to use, which really dilutes the process of creating a character. It goes from too little to too much, with nothing in between, and this sort of game shouldn't be about grinding anyway. There are various other RPG mechanics. You'll regularly find yourself with a main mission, and then various side missions. Speaking to certain NPCs can open up new side missions, or change existing ones. It's also possible to fail missions without having to restart. It just factors in what happened, and changes the narrative accordingly. This is cool and complex, and there are even entire levels you'll bypass depending on your choices. But it's also quite buggy and problematic, and I've had to restart games several times because my progress has been blocked. And it's also just hard to care about this stuff because the entire RPG aspect is so badly implemented, as is the story stuff. In fact, it's easiest to just think of this game as being more like Crysis than Deus Ex, to think of it more like an ability-based FPS rather than a true FPS RPG, because the combat is awesome. There's a huge range of weapons, abilities and playstyles available to you. You can grab an invisibility cloak and a sniper rifle and sneak your way through the game assassinating enemies. You can psionically summon clones of yourself or hire flying little robots to fight alongside you. You can grab an armor enhancement and a katana and run around slicing people in half. You can grab a minigun and just lay waste to everything you see. You can hack into the cyber brains of enemies and make them kill their allies. Or you can use psionic abilities to teleport, implode enemies, send them insane, and more. The sheer breadth of styles the game facilitates is amazing, and that's coupled with the combat feeling just right. The guns all feel great to use, the sound effects are satisfying, and this is the first FPS I've played that does depth of field just right when aiming. It adds a genuine sense of depth rather than just blurring the fuck out of everything. The human AI is pretty impressive. It does have some funny quirks, like they'll sometimes line up and then the guys at the back will kill all their allies ahead of them while trying to shoot you. But the way they move around is very impressive, and they'll actually take cover when you fire at them rather than just standing out in the open like silly sausages, but only sometimes. The enemies themselves look pretty awesome too. As I said, the whole aesthetic is magnificent, and all of the character models look great. Some look like techno-samurai, others look like chaplains from Warhammer 40k, and others still look like neo-knights. It's just all very cool looking. and it helps make them fun to fight. But there are a bunch of goofy enemies too, as I said. These weird giant lizard men with huge hands, these weird women wearing white dresses, werewolves, and more. The game has some kind of explanation for what these things are, but I wasn't really following it, and I'd be surprised if you do either. Great though the combat styles are, they aren't well balanced. As a level 0 with no skills, blowing someone's brains out with a sniper rifle at 70 feet is obviously just much easier than charging at them to stab them. Playing a successful melee character takes a lot of patience, and you'll be halfway into the game before you stop relying on your backup firearm. Stealth similarly isn't a supported playstyle, in as much as you get stuff for killing enemies, and you get nothing for sneaking past them. So as I said, if you go into this game expecting it to be Deus Ex except with good combat, you're going to be disappointed because the entire RPG aspect is just not well designed at all. But treat it like an ability-based FPS and don't expect any kind of balance and just go with what works, and it's just loads of fun, especially once your character begins to take shape and you move into a new game with the same character. The death and saving system is very unusual and not well explained, but I really enjoy it. It works pretty much the same way as a hack and slash RPG like Diablo 2. Rather than your point in the game being saved, it's your character that saves, and what the character has unlocked. There's no manual saving, but every time you quit the game to start over, you'll either be in your temple headquarters, which is where you go on new missions and also buy stuff for your character, or you'll find yourself in a mission, but back at the beginning. This means you have to play through most or all of a mission in one sitting, and they aren't always short. But once you get used to it, I think you'll come to prefer it to conventional saving. I definitely did. You have a respawning device which allows you to respawn almost instantly where you died, and it has a charge of 9. You can increase that, but I doubt you ever will. So you have 9 lives, but once you run out of them, rather than it being game over or something like that, you return to a dream state where you're told that what you saw was a vision of your potential future. Leaving the dream world, you find yourself with 9 lives again, but you're back at the start of the mission you died on. It may seem weird and cheap, but it works well. It means you can use death as a tool, but overdo it and you're punished. The hacking system is really well implemented. I really mean this. It's the best hacking I have ever seen in a game. You and your target each have a value for attack, defense, and health, which is determined by your hacking stat and certain cybernetic augmentations. And then you have 6 viruses you can upload, 1 each to increase your attack, defense, and 1 to decrease each of the same values of your enemy. Your goal is to reduce the enemy's health to 0 before they do the same to you, so you'll have to use cunning and skill to reduce your enemy's stats, while also keeping the enemy from doing the same to you by increasing your stats. It takes about a second to upload your virus, but if you click your next one while your current one is uploading, it'll overwrite it, so timing is vital in order to be efficient. The thing that makes it so wonderful is that it's entirely stat-based, as you'd expect from an RPG, but it's also completely skill-based too. It's a perfect fusing of 2 important things, and it's a pretty wonderful minigame. As much as I love the combat and hacking, it's definitely the levels themselves that are the star of the game. From a smoggy, polluted industrial zone, to the dusty surface of Mars, to a claustrophobic maze of corridors looking suspiciously like something from Aliens. There's an amazing range of environments, but it's the Blade Runner-esque cyberpunk cities that are by far the coolest. And this is the first time I've ever seen this kind of environment so amazingly rendered in a 3D game. The levels are also miniature open worlds, especially the city levels. They're small, but they feel like genuine locations, and there's a lot of back and forth as you complete your various goals. It's very cool, and it might be unfair to say this here, but I'd love to see a proper RPG set in this kind of environment. In addition to the single player, which ought to take you around 10 to 15 hours to complete, there's also a pretty extensive multiplayer option. You can play through the entire campaign cooperatively, and this works well as it gives you more opportunity to min-max your character in a particular specialisation, while other players offset your weaknesses, and vice versa. So I'd say the game definitely is at its finest in co-op. You can also play special missions separate to the campaign in co-op, but these don't add a whole lot to the game. So the bottom line with E.Y.E is, The world is awesome, but it has a lot of goofy stuff in it. The RPG mechanics are dense and complex, but poorly explained and sometimes faulty. The combat is amazing, but the different playstyles are poorly balanced. E.Y.E is in many ways a very, very good game, and remembering that this is an indie game, it's a truly astounding accomplishment. But it's also in many ways a very bad game. You should definitely check it out if you're a fan of great FPS combat or cyberpunk stuff, but you really do need to be very patient to get anything out of the game.